Hello and welcome to Access Asia. I'm Delano D'Souza. Coming up, India and the European Union agree to wrap up a free trade deal by the end of the year. Brussels dispatching its top brass to New Delhi as it looks for new friends on the global stage. North Korea opens up to Western tourists for the first time in years, but the country's capital, Pyongyang, was kept off limits for now. And China's blockbuster Niza 2 becomes the highest-grossing animated movie in history, the film even dethroning Disney from its top spot. But first, the EU Commission President and virtually all the bloc's commissioners made an unprecedented visit to India as the bloc aims to strengthen its partnership with the world's fifth largest economy. Ursula von der Leyen met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the pair pledged to conclude a free trade agreement by the end of this year. The visit by the EU's top brass to India comes as relations with the United States are starting to fray and concerns over China's growing influence worry both Brussels and New Delhi.
We both stand to lose from a world of spheres of influence and isolationism, and we both stand to gain from a world of cooperation and working together. Because we can offer each other distinctive alternatives and tools to make ourselves stronger, more secure, and more sovereign in today's world. But I believe this modern version of great power competition is also an opportunity for Europe and India to reimagine its partnership.
We can now bring in Anunita Chandrasekhar, Fellow at the Centre for European Reform, who joins us from London. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme today. Now, the EU is clearly trying to stroke India's ego with this visit. What exactly did the bloc get out of it?
You know, the planets are aligned for Europe and India. This is clearly a charm offensive, and as von der Leyen outlined, they're clearly looking for cooperation in trade, technology, and security and defence. So whilst these are kind of obvious areas of cooperation, I think there's also a sense that Europe is trying to put itself on India's radar as the EU, because whilst Europe has many kind of close bilateral relations with India through countries, notably France, I think there is less momentum on the European level. So I think this is a really good chance for the Commission to signal in an unprecedented visit that they want India, that India is on the agenda.
Because it seems like the EU is looking for friends, new friends, if you will, because its old alliances, particularly with the United States, seem to be up in the air at this point in time. And it's also looking for alternatives to China. Is India the viable alternative?
Well, I think India-EU relations have been gathering momentum for the last few years. There's definitely the sense of, the Trump factor in recent weeks with threats of tariffs, with the Transatlantic Security Alliance being called into question. There's definitely a sense that Europe has an increased urgency in its search for new partners. But I think India is not just any new partner. As you mentioned, also China is something that, the EU has moved towards seeing as a systemic rival in the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific itself is an increased area of interest for Europe since around 2021. There was the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think India is a much more like-minded pillar for Europe, being non-Western but not anti-Western or a systemic rival in the same way that China is.
Anunita, the visit by these EU commissioners comes just on the heels of the UK and India resuming trade talks. Has India emerged as a global sweet spot?
Absolutely. I think if you look at Modi's recent visit, so he was in Paris for the AI summit, which he was co-chairing with Macron, and he went straight afterwards to America to visit Trump. And also there was talks of, huge increases in trade between the US and India. So I think India is very much trying to optimize its multi-aligned foreign policy strategy and make itself known as a global sweet spot, or Vishwamitra, as they like to call themselves, a kind of friend to the world that's able to deal with many contradictory partners, such as, the US and Russia, or Europe and Iran, whilst pursuing its own interests.
But it seems one thing everyone seems to have in common, whether it's the United States, whether it's the EU, or the UK for that matter, is there will be pressure on India to lower tariffs, won't there?
I mean, absolutely. I think one of the things that both Modi and von der Leyen announced earlier was that they hope to conclude an EU-India free trade agreement by the end of the year. So there is a sense that, these free trade negotiations have been ongoing for, it's around, I think, 2007. They had a break for almost 10 years. And I think after being resumed a few years ago, there's a much greater sense of urgency, especially now with the Trump factor. India signed a recent trade agreement with EFTA countries last year, which was the first, of its kind with European partners, and which I think sets a really interesting precedent. And Europe has also been more negotiable on deals with new partners. For example, the Mercosur trade agreement it signed last year with Latin American countries. So I think both sides are potentially more willing to make concessions, and especially in light of the current kind of geopolitical climate.
Exactly. A lot of uncertainty. Anunita Chandrasekhar, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Next, it's one of the most isolated and sanctioned countries on earth. North Korea usually keeps its borders closed, but a group of Western tourists were recently allowed rare access. They traveled to the country's remote special economic zone of Rason for a 5-day visit, but they were kept out of the capital, Pyongyang. For more on this story, we can bring in France 24's Jenny Shin. Jenny, great to see you. So Western tourists are now back in North Korea?
That's right, Delano. So a remote part of North Korea has reopened to tourists this month, bringing in the first international visitors in 5 years, apart from a small group of Russian tourists who were allowed in the country last year. So this recent batch includes nationals from France, from Germany, Italy, Greece, even New Zealand and Australia. Now, they crossed by land from China into the city of Rason, which is located where North Korea's borders meet China and Russia. Now, what is there to do in this relatively unknown North Korean city, you may ask? Well, you can visit factories, you can visit shops, schools, you can even do conventional tourist activities like attending cooking classes, for example. Now, what's interesting is that Rason is where the special economic zone is located, as you mentioned earlier. So this is the only part of North Korea where capitalism is openly promoted. Residents can, for example, buy and sell houses. They can even open a bank account. Now, just to give you a bit of context, the country has been closed entirely to all international tourists since 2020. That's, of course, the height of the COVID pandemic. That's when North Korea jetted out its diplomats and heavily curtailed border traffic. And they only started easing restrictions and reopening borders in 2022. So the manager of the company arranging the tours made a recent comment on what this reopening means to both North Korea and its visitors. Let's take a listen.
It's good to give people who've been waiting 5 years to go to North Korea an opportunity to finally set foot in that country, and good for the North Koreans who've had no contact with any foreign visitors for a long time to finally get the limited chance that they have to interact with visitors and to see that we're human too, and for us to see the same of them.
So the recent tours are an indication that North Korea may be gearing up for a full resumption of tourism. And I say full because, as you mentioned earlier as well, the capital, Pyongyang, is still off limits.
I'm curious, though, why are they doing this now, Jenny?
Well, the main reason is to bring in much needed foreign currency to North Korea because we mustn't forget that North Korea is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world due to its nuclear program. And it's also one of the poorest countries in the world. And before the pandemic, tourism was a relatively easy and, most importantly, legitimate way to bring foreign currency into the country. Now, Beijing has been Pyongyang's top trading partner for over 2 decades, accounting for roughly 98% of total North Korean imports and exports in 2023. And initially, Chinese nationals made up most of the tourists, representing more than 90% of total international tourists visiting North Korea. What's interesting is that for 2 years, Chinese and North Korean ties have been deteriorating and Chinese tourists have been dwindling as well. Meanwhile, the first foreign nationals to visit in 2024 were Russians. A total of 880 Russian tourists visited North Korea last year. And some experts say this signals just how much closer Russia and North Korea have become, with, of course, Pyongyang supplying weapons and troops for Moscow amid the war in Ukraine. So all this to say, North Korea plans to continue bringing tourists in the coming months, albeit under very strict restrictions.
Yeah.
They won't see much of the country because they are, of course, determined to project a certain image of the country, which is not a true reflection of the very harsh and oppressed realities that North Koreans face.
Indeed. Jenny Shin, thank you very much for that. Next, China's Ni Za 2 has become the highest-grossing animated movie worldwide, dethroning Disney from the top spot. It's also the first film to gross over $1 billion in a single market. The fantasy adventure stars a demonic little child in the lead role. Olivia Salazar-Winspear tells us more.
Dazzling audiences with its dramatic fight scenes, cutting-edge special effects and quirky take on Chinese mythology, Ni Za 2 has become a movie phenomenon both at home and abroad. The animated blockbuster draws inspiration from a story dating back to the Ming Dynasty. Released for the Lunar New Year in China, it's also seen crowds flock to the cinema in Australia, Canada and the US, where the story of a little demon warrior has delighted international audiences.
I really enjoyed the story. I think I really enjoyed the fight scenes as well. The animation was so fun. It was super pretty and beautiful. Aesthetically, it's distinct from a lot of Western animation, and I really like that. I think that was a breath of fresh air.
Ni Za 2 also highlights the Chinese film industry's technical expertise in special effects, corralling a production crew of 4,000 people. Its success has also sparked a new interest in the regions depicted in the story, with tourists now keen to see some of the incredible diversity of China's landscapes.
I found out in the movie that it was about a certain location here in China, so I figured I'd go with my son because he loved the movie. The fact that he's half Chinese and half Canadian, and he's really excited about learning more about the Chinese culture, I'm happy for that, and I'm all for it.
Tour operators in the Jiangxi province say they've seen a 23% boost in foreign visitors thanks to the film's popularity. Add that to the endless varieties of merchandise Ni Za has shifted and almost $2 billion in ticket sales, it looks like the little warrior has won the fight for cinematic supremacy.
That's it for this edition of Access Asia. From all of us on the team, thank you very much for watching.